Hey everyone, so we're back with a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Josh Hammer, who has written an incredible book that I just finished reading. It's Israel and Civilization. It goes through a seamless connection between Torah viewpoints, traditional Jewish viewpoints, and the American founding, and how our future together is really based on the Jewish world and the Christian world coming together as one to fight radical ideology. So, Josh, thanks so much for joining us here today, and I look forward to a great conversation with you.
Rabbi Taylor, you're a good friend. Thank you for reading the book and for the very kind words. Always great to chat with you.
By the way, go buy this book right now on Amazon, everybody. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about some questions that are on people's minds that I don't think a lot of people have a good understanding of. So with the situation in Israel right now, there are a large chunk of people from the Arab and Muslim world that live in Gaza, and there are a lot that live in the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Now, a lot of people who follow this issue and are pro-Israel also know that there are millions of Arab Muslims that live in Israel proper and live a normal life like every other resident and citizen that lives there. So can you explain to us sort of the history of how these groups of people got to Gaza and to the West Bank, and their lives are a bit different than the ones living in Israel proper, and sort of just how this whole situation evolved into what it is?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, I will try to do so as succinctly as possible. So the Jews, of course, are exiled from the Holy Land multiple times, but perhaps for the longest stretch of time following the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. At some point shortly thereafter, the Roman conquerors who kicked out the Jews from the Holy Land renamed this territory Palestina, and it was a reference to the Philistines of old. It was all part of a de-Judaizing imperative there. It was essentially trying to remove any vestige, any tint of monotheism, any remaining hint of anything that would offend Roman imperial ideology at that time. This is around the same time that the Roman Empire was slowly beginning the transition from paganism to Christianity, but it was still primarily pagan at that time there. So they were not even remotely interested in what the Jews had to offer about their claims of monotheism and the one true God and so forth there. So that was the initial origins of this term Palestine, and the term ends up being used more or less more or less for 2 millennia. But there was never, Rabbi, there was never, ever any kind of independent state, literally ever. There was never an independent state for all the various empires that controlled this tiny sliver of land between the river and the sea, as the hooligans call it. There was never, ever an independent state called Palestine. For hundreds of years, the Ottoman Turks ran it. The Romans ran it before then there. And then most recently, prior to the foundation of the modern state of Israel in 1948, it was part of the British mandate, for Palestine, as the case may be. In fact, just starting in the early 20th century, prior to the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948 there, what did you call Jews living there in Eretz Yisrael, on the land of Israel? Well, some of them might be called Palestinians, in fact. Rabbi, you've met my wife. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. She's a Sephardic Jew. Her parents are from the land of Israel, and her father's mother, so her grandmother, may her memory be a blessing, was was born in Eretz Yisrael back in the 1930s, well before the founding of the state there. And she had a Palestinian passport, right? I mean, if you go back and you look at the quote unquote Palestinian international soccer team when they were playing like Australia and whatnot there from the 1930s, I think a lot of people would be surprised, to find that the names of the footballers on the Palestinian soccer team from the 1930s had names like Goldschmidt and Cohen and Rosenstein and whatnot, right? I mean, it was not what you conjure up today there. So again, a lot of people traverse throughout this land over the centuries there. The simplest explanation as to how you had Arabs come into the Levant, this part of the Eastern Mediterranean, is the same reason that you had Arabs make it to Iraq outside of the Arabian Peninsula, the same way you had plenty of Arabs make it to Egypt, to Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, other parts of northern Africa as well. which is that what started Islam in the Arabian Peninsula there, and then this is kind of the origins of the Arab ethnicity as we know it today there. Ultimately, because Islam is an evangelizing creed, very much unlike Judaism in that respect there. And we all know roughly the story of Muhammad and how he sought to conquer and spread and evangelize there. So the Arab people, not just Islam as a religion, but the Arab people start to spread as well beyond the confines of the Arab Peninsula there. And that's the very short answer as to how you end up getting large scale Arabs in the Near East. Now, it's worth noting that not all the Arabs in the Near East and Levant are actually religiously Muslim. You have Arab Christians as well. You have Arab Druze, which are kind of their own religious entity there. They don't really fit quite neatly into any category. They're essentially Muslim, but there are some slight but important differences there. Now, as far as the differences between the Arabs living in Judea and Samaria and Gaza versus pre I don't want to say pre-67 Israel, because to me 67 is kind of it's kind of an arbitrary border, but the difference legally speaking is noteworthy, because if for the Arabs living in Judea and Samaria, they are going to be subject to the whims of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization under the Oslo Accords. So for the Arabs living under the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization there, they are legally subject to many different rules and parameters than the Arabs that are living in Israel proper, for lack of a better description there. Look, there's all sorts of international law ramifications too. This is kind of all in the book. In chapter 5, I talk about the international law case as to why Israel has the best claim under international law to Judea and Samaria, and frankly, in many ways, Gaza itself there, Rabbi. But I mean, that's the kind of the quick and dirty answer as to how you have this large-scale Arab population. It essentially is kind of an Islam-induced out-migration and spread of Arabs originally from the Arabian Peninsula. They get to the Levant, they get to Northern Africa, and so forth.
Well, let's talk about more recent history. Let's say post 1948 up until the present. So in that region, so there were Jews living there. There was large Arab population already living there. Late 1800s, early 1900s, when the state of Israel is slowly taking its form, that it becomes a state in 1948. Now, in 1948, you have Arabs and Jews living there, and we've all been to Israel. Some of us many times. Those that are watching, many of you have been to Israel. You see Arabs and Muslims walking the streets of Jerusalem, or wherever you go on the tours and whatnot. Everyone's living a normal life. There's no apartheid. There's freedom for everybody. However, the lifestyle seems to be very different in the Gaza and West Bank, so-called West Bank regions. And there is a distinction between if you're an Arab Muslim living in Israel proper, living in a place like Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, and if you're living in the West Bank or Gaza, as far as like the perception or what your lifestyle might look like. So how did some Arabs and Muslims get to live in Israel proper, and they're living like under regular circumstances with total freedoms, as opposed to someone who's living in Gaza under these sort of terrorist regimes in different forms over the years? How does that distinction, how did that come to be?
Okay, so there was really no legal distinction, frankly, in many ways before 1948 between the Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Ashdod, Ashkelon coastline and Ramallah, Jenin, Nablus, Hebron, and so forth. There was really no legal distinction there. So let's back up a second. So the modern Middle East is carved essentially out of the ashes of World War I, not World War II, but World War I. And this is when the victorious European powers, the British, the French, and so forth, start to decide how to carve up the Middle East over the defeated Ottoman Empire and groups like that. This is where you get the Sykes-Picot Agreement there, and this is how you get the original mandate system that was really codified at this kind of obscure conference in Italy in 1920 called the San Remo Conference. So the way it works as far as the territory that we are concerned with now, the Holy Land and so forth there, is that you had the British mandate for Palestine, which essentially gave Britain the ability to govern this as a territory following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, following the end of World War I. But the British mandate for Palestine was then split as well between the mandate for Transjordan and mandatory Palestine. The former, the mandate for Transjordan, it's worth noting here, this actually was supposed to be the quote unquote Palestinian state, the actual Arab state in the original so-called two-state solution. This was literally the original Arab state. So, people say some people kind of say to this day that, Jordan is the actual Palestinian state. It literally is. I mean, that like actually is the history. I mean, whether people want to know the history or not, and you're allowed to be willfully ignorant, I suppose, there, but that is the literal history. That under the actual mandate, it was supposed to be Jordan. So, and by the way, I was looking at the actual physical size of land. Jordan is substantially larger than the original area that is mandatory Palestine, which roughly correlates to the borders of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Okay, so within mandatory Palestine there, that is how it more or less goes for about 28 years, give or take, 27 years from 1920 to 1947. A lot of things happen in those 27 years, obviously. You have, most importantly, you have many European Jews trying to flee oppression beginning in the 1930s. They see the writing on the wall coming with the Nazis, try to emigrate there. Unfortunately, the British have a mixed history at best when it comes to allowing Jewish immigration to this British-controlled territory, neither here nor there for present purposes. That takes us then to November of 1947, which was the United Nations' first attempt to then create what might be noticeable as a modern, quote unquote, two-state solution, carving up just mandatory Palestine, just Eretz Israel, into then two micro-states as well. And by the way, the borders of this UN proposed partition were extraordinarily disfavorable to the Jews. The Jews basically got a tiny sliver of coastline. It wasn't even contiguous. And of course, the Jews 2 years after the end of the Shoah were just totally desperate. They said, yes, of course, we'll take this. The Arabs said no. A few months later, May 1948, David Ben-Gurion declares independence. Harry Truman, the president, recognizes Israel 11 minutes later. Arab armies invade literally within minutes from all sides, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and so forth, trying to throw the Jews back into the sea. Israel ends up winning this war of independence against the Arab invading army aggressors. And they reach essentially a non-binding armistice line. This is the key point under international law. This was a non-binding armistice line, essentially a temporary ceasefire line. That is the so-called Green Line, the so-called 1967 borders, for instance, that former President Obama liked to refer to. It is this non-binding armistice line that was where the 1948 war ended. Now, the key point for international law, because I was emphasizing the whole mandate of Palestine story for a reason there. The key point for international law, there's an international law principle called uti possidetis juris, if I'm pronouncing the Latin correctly. And what it essentially says is when you have a new state formed in a certain part of the world, that new state inherits the pre-existing borders of the state that most recently existed in that same part of the world. So what that means is that when Ben-Gurion declares independence for Israel in 48, the state of Israel inherits the full borders of mandatory Palestine, which, recall, was all of Eretz Israel, including Judea and Samaria. So to this day, nothing has changed. To this day, Israel has the best legal international claim to Judea and Samaria. In fact, the best way, at best, the way to view Judea and Samaria between 1948 and 1967, the Six-Day War, the best way to view that, the most favorable way to view that towards the Arabs is that it was an armistice. The worst way to view it is that they arguably were themselves actually illegal occupiers. And we know what Jordan did during those 19 years to the old city of Jerusalem, to many Jewish holy sites. They destroyed synagogues. They ran roughshod over any number of Jewish holy sites, including right there in the holy city itself, Jerusalem there. But that was the beginnings of this kind of bifurcated system between the Arabs who ended up on one side of this armistice line, the Green Line, and the other. And in many ways, there's been a lot of changes. There's been Oslo Accords and so forth there. But in many ways, that's kind of still where we're at today.
So since 1948, you mentioned when David Ben-Gurion establishes the state, Harry Truman signs on right away that the United States is going to support that. And throughout its brief history, the United States has been very, very connected, very friendly towards Israel. I mean, sometimes more, sometimes less, but overall, they've been a very staunch ally together. And in the original Trump administration, we find the same thing with the Abraham Accords and seeking to bring peace throughout the region. There was always a very strong bond between not only Israel and the United States, but between Bibi Netanyahu and President Trump. So in this time around, we just started, second term just started fairly recently. And there's kind of like there's speculation, there's mixed talk, a lot going on right now. Trump was just in the Middle East recently, making all sorts of overtures to the Qataris. What's your gut feeling about the future of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel going forward under Trump term number two?
Well, there's a lot of things happening right now. It's very much a real-time kinetic situation. On the one hand, I think it's worth noting that the rumors of a rift between Trump and Netanyahu personally are probably exaggerated, right? I mean, Netanyahu has been the only foreign leader who has visited the White House multiple times already in just the first few months of the Trump presidency. President Trump himself was actually asked directly by Brett Baer of Fox News whether there is a rift, and Trump unequivocally says no. Netanyahu has a very tough job right now. People forget about October 7th. It was one of the worst days in the history of humanity. So it doesn't appear publicly that there is any sort of major rift. I think what you are seeing play out, because there's been any number of articles now at the Washington Post and New York Times, CNN just had one yesterday. This is actually a very leaky administration. There are a lot of people at very high level, staffers, I think, for senior officials who have a habit of leaking, frankly, to liberal publications like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and most recently yesterday, CNN, which is a very bad thing. And I would encourage the president to try to crack down on people leaking to leftist media. It's not exactly the right way to run a right of center administration. But I think a lot of people that are leaking here are doing so with an agenda. They're trying to do so in a way that tries to sow the seeds of distrust or discord between the U.S.-Israel relationship there. Now, here is what I will say. There is a little bit more than simply just leaking and perception. I am not a fan of the Qatar bromance. Okay, I am just unequivocally not a fan of trying to welcome Qatar into this kind of pro-Western aligned alliance. I have much less of an issue with the Saudis and the Emiratis. In fact, the entire Abraham Accords framework during the first Trump administration, which saw these ultimately culminated in these landmark peace agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, was ultimately really predicated on this sober prudential view of the Middle East as being this dichotomy, this bifurcation between this moderate axis and this Islamist axis. The moderate axis, or the pro-Western axis, depending on the countries involved, had Israel, and then the non-Islamist Arab countries, so Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and so forth. And then the other hand, the axis was the Iranian regime above all, probably Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey, and Qatar, which is the financial and spiritual home of Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al Jazeera, and so forth there. I worry that the second Trump administration is not quite as clear-eyed on that bifurcation, that understanding of the region that led to the Abraham Accords. There are various reasons to speculate as to why exactly that is happening. Qatar is obviously an extravagantly wealthy and very, very prosperous country. They throw money like few other countries do. They try to buy out Americans and everything from $400 million plus Boeing jets to hosting our troops at Al Udeid Air Base, to pumping more money in our universities than literally any other foreign country in the world. That goes on and on and on. They're very good. They're very savvy at trying to buy off influence, but this is in fact actually a very, very dangerous country. Then you throw into the mix also the ongoing Iranian nuclear negotiations, which I think have a lot of fans of Donald Trump's first term foreign policy. You know, that, I mean, let's not forget that in 2018, Donald Trump ripped up Barack Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. So the fact that there's this negotiation happening now, I think, has a lot of people with a long enough memory to remember 2017, 2018, I think makes those folks feel a little confused at best, uneasy at worst. But the recent rhetoric from Trump, even the most recent rhetoric from Steve Witkoff, who I've actually been critical of at times, but his most recent rhetoric has actually been quite good. So I think some of the pushback probably has made them kind of develop a harder line when it comes to this no nuclear enrichment hard line. The most recent I saw, the latest, is that it seems like there's actually a genuine standoff actually between the Ayatollah Khamenei and Steve Witkoff and the American negotiating position. Where exactly that standoff goes, I suppose we shall see. So, you know, all that's to say, in sum, there are definitely some reasons for potential concern, Rabbi, but I'm also not necessarily losing sleep over it.
Okay, that's good to know. And last thing in closing, you mentioned in your book that it's up to really the Jewish world and the Christian world uniting for the cause of America, of Israel, of Western values. How do you see that going forward? Why is that the pathway forward? And sort of how do you see it all kind of playing out in real time?
Sure. So the main thesis of this book, Israel and Civilization, essentially accepts the premise that after October 7th, the world changed and that Western civilization is at a crossroads. And I identify three threats that are acting with hegemony and with subjugationist goals to try to ultimately bring us under their rule. And those three threats, in no particular order, are wokeism, Islamism, and what I refer to as global neoliberalism. The first two are pretty self-explanatory. The latter is the United Nations, World Economic Forum. It's essentially John Lennon's song Imagine playing out on a global chessboard, this homogenizing imperative to stamp out all differences, national distinctions, religious distinctions, and so forth there. And to me, those are the three things the Western civilization is going up against, is wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. Now, the relevant question then is, if we're going to fight back and ward off these three extremely powerful, well-financed, very dangerous threats, then we have to make sure we know who we are and what we stand for. So that leads to a very obvious question, which is, what is the West? What is Western civilization? So I make an extended argument in this book that Western civilization, yes, I mean, Leo Strauss famously said the Western civilization is this DNA-like strand double helix of reason and revelation. But my contention throughout this book is that revelation has tended to get the short shrift of this particular DNA-like strand, and that we would behoove ourselves, we would be very wise to recover a very sound, firm understanding of revelation, which in layman's terms means the Bible, which means the biblical inheritance there. I argue that Western civilization, as we know today, begins with God's revelation to Moses and the Israelites there standing at the base of Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. I mean, that is the origin of Western civilization. And, I'm an American patriot, you're an American patriot. Our founders understood this extraordinarily well. I mean, I note that the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, outside on the Liberty Bell, it's not Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics that is inscribed there. It's Leviticus chapter 19. Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, they won the national seal of the United States not to be Socrates teaching Plato in the academy or Cicero speaking on the floor of the Roman Senate, but they wanted to be Moses parting the sea, Yam Suf. I mean, with the Israelites there trying to go across from Pharaoh and all the chariots, they are in pursuit. So this imagery, this understanding that America, in some ways at least, was, as Abraham Lincoln famously put it in a February 1861 speech, an almost chosen people, this kind of covenantal conception of American nationhood there. This is deeply, deeply ingrained in who we are there. And Jews and Christians, as these two biblical religions there, we have so much more in common in trying to kind of double down and to reclaim our righteous inheritance, our mantle from the founders, from men like Lincoln there, because only by understanding that and by coming together in defense of the Bible, of the biblical inheritance, of all the good that monotheism and the Bible has done to develop the Western world there, only by doubling down on that and reclaiming that can we possibly have any chance, I assert, of warding off these three aforementioned hegemonic threats: wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism.
I couldn't agree more. The morals that have been contained in the Bible that make our history are the things that are going to, by getting back to them, are going to help us have a shared destiny together as well. So Josh, thanks so much for joining us. Everyone, go get this book. You will not regret it. It's eloquently written. There's a lot of information in there, but in a very easy to read sort of way. I hope that you will do yourself a favor and get it. Go follow Josh as well on the Josh Hammer Show. It's Newsweek's podcast. And Josh, always a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.